Hello, hi, welcome. All right, and so get your names down real quickly. So this week we are on the failure of the Confederation, our first technical government that we had post independence from England, and it didn't last very long. All right, the interpretation you have in number one regarding its failure. If you've had a chance to look at it, maybe you've noticed from high school, etc. But it is not. It's not cutting edge at all. It's a very old thesis. I've just had a hard time with other topics. I find it rather easy to find a new cutting edge thesis on a given topic, right? A new interpretation of this or of that. But with the Articles of Confederation, with the explanation for its failure, it's pretty monotone. It's been the same since I was a student, way back when in the 90s. And so I just kind of went with it. It's something that you'll be familiar with if you go on as a history major. It's one to know, but again, I'm not particularly proud of it for that reason, because I like cutting edge new interpretations to stuff, right? So I want to apologize right away that you're not getting that with this topic. I've just yet to find something to be honest. All right. So before I get into this, number one of just two sections for this week, does anybody have anything to share? Anybody have any questions or comments or anything of that sort? All right. Okay, so I'm hoping that your silence, I'm gonna interpret it in a positive way, that you're up to speed and everything's going okay. All right. So with this interpretation that you're probably already familiar with, right, is that when we gained our independence and a few years thereafter, we were at the height of our Enlightenment propaganda. As you guys may recall, when we did the War for Independence assignment, remember number two, section number two, the argument posed by Bernard Bailyn. And he said it was all about ideas that percolated, right, at that time of the Revolutionary War, and that Americans became enlightened, and they began to develop new consciousness, a new worldview, new expectations, right, for what they felt entitled to. And so that you see that originally in this Confederation, okay? So for instance, right, a lot of the rhetoric that came from the Scottish Enlightenment was libertarian, and that really took hold evidently in the American colonies during the War for Independence. So remember, libertarian, I think of like that symbol, right, of the 13 colonies in the form of a snake, and it said government, don't tread on me. So libertarian, you have a healthy fear of excessively powerful, excessively centralized, and unaccountable government. And you want just the opposite, right? If you're libertarian, you don't trust power in the hands of common people, or in any person for that matter. You don't want too much power in anyone's hands. So you want checks and balances. And you also want government to be small as far as the resources it has at hand in size and scope. And also you want it to be decentralized, all right? And you want it to be localized, right? And the idea is that you could hold your politicians more effectively accountable if you have them working in your own, a county or city, a region. And so at least thus ran the rationale for all of this, okay, for the Scottish Enlightenment. So we were somewhat in the mood, so to speak. So we developed a deliberately weak government, right? The 13 states in many ways were virtually autonomous, were virtually independent. They had to have a super majority to pass laws. They had to have unanimity, all 13, to add an amendment. So that was virtual impossibility. They had to have your elected reps had to consent to your taxes. And if they didn't, the tax was not collected in your district. So imagine that today, right? If our rep of 30,000, our 30,000 citizen congressional district rep votes no on a given tax, and then in our area of 30,000 civilians that he or she represents, they cannot collect the tax. That's the way it was with this Confederation, right? It was that just kind of stubbornly stingy in handing over power to anything that even approximated a centralized government. Okay. There was not an executive. It was basically just a legislator that would meet. So they wanted nothing that could be even likened to a king, right? The different states, some like Pennsylvania, opted with no governor at all because it reminded them of the royal governor and his heavy-handedness, and so they wanted none of it. In the other states, they had governors, but they insisted that the governors now be elected and that the governors be accountable and have checks and balances with the legislator, right? So they greatly deliberately weakened the power of their governors. Okay. And so you have here, see here, first Vermont, then Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, New York outlawed slavery as inconsistent with enlightened rhetoric, right? So that's a great thing. So they were like in an enlightened phase of American political development during this time of the Confederacy, okay? And then also, let's see here. They also were big on, like with the Comity Clause. The Comity Clause stated that if you were granted citizenship in your home state, because it was up to each state to define citizenship, the requirements thereof, then you were granted the same rights. You would be granted the same rights if you went to another state. You were granted that citizenship opportunity. And so they were really trying to enhance individual opportunity, accountability, and weakness of government. Because that was in line with the Scottish and the French Enlightenments. Okay. So, you have a proliferation of schools, you have a proliferation of libraries, universities, newspapers. Okay. So a lot was going on at this time, right? So it all seems great until we get to the thesis, right? And that is notice you can find it in the first sentence. Go back to it. Lack of restraint and indulgence in selfish impulses killed what hopes the newly independent American people had in institutionalizing some of the most enlightened, libertarian, and radically different ideas percolating in the mid to late 1700s. So the idea is, right, is the way this generation behaved, they had the utmost liberty from an obtrusive, big central government getting into their business, right? And they blew it, they messed it up because they acted so selfishly and so short-sightedly. Okay. And we're going to get into some examples that I give in here to illustrate that. Now, remember, from the get-go, the conservatives, okay, calling themselves the Federalists pretty soon, the conservatives already, they've had a classical education, and they have, like John Adams, and they have read how if a government is that a government historically can become arguably too democratic. You look at Pericles as he ruled Athens, and you see how that did not necessarily turn out very well. You learn about the Gracchus brothers in Rome and how they tried to give more power to the people in the Roman Republic and make it more of a democracy of the people, the demos. And that didn't end well. Okay. And so you have Plato and Aristotle, who stated that people can only handle freedom. People should only have the amount of freedom that they can handle, that they will not abuse. That freedom requires virtue and self-restraint, civic virtue, putting the needs of the country above your own selfish needs, etc. Right? And so they said, for that reason, a democracy will oftentimes end in a chaotic subordination to a demagogue, to a manipulator of the people who will become a tyrant over them. That a democracy will not last, Aristotle and Plato thought. So the conservatives and the liberals, right, who are amongst the founding fathers, they had read this stuff in their education. And the conservatives were trying to tell the liberals, right, the libertarians of that day, guys, look at history. Look at the Greek philosophers. We can't allow our government to become too democratic. It'll only end in chaos. All right. And then the other historical entity that they were critical of, the conservative founding fathers, besides democracy, ruled by the people, the demos, right, the commoners, was a confederacy, right? When the states are almost autonomous, they're almost independent, and there's deliberately not much of a central, cohesive nature to the union of the states. So they said, look at the Italian city-states, look at the Scandinavian confederations, and they said, and you'll find they too ended in chaos. There was not enough law and order. There was not enough cooperation, and it didn't end well for those confederations historically. So when the people in the given states, of the 13 states, begin acting, showing signs of acting very selfishly, very short-sightedly, very rashly, then the conservatives will turn to the liberals, their fellow leaders, right, who they too were classically educated and had read the same stuff, and can say, I told you so. I told you so. So that you have people like Thomas Jefferson, who was a spokesman for the libertarian liberals, when they began devising a more centralized, a less democratic constitution that we'll get to next. Thomas Jefferson left the country. He literally went on one of his trips to France. And that was part of the interpretation of Jefferson, actually, that he was extremely, in some ways, very non-confrontational with when it came to political confrontation. But also to some people, they believe it was evidence that he knew deep down he didn't put up much of a fight, because he knew deep down that the conservatives were right, that they had tried a very decentralized government. They had tried a relatively democratic government, and the people messed it up. And it wasn't working. All right, so how do they act rashly? The first example that comes to my mind is with land and credit. All right, a lot of the voters fought for the right to go squat on Western land, because all the good land was taken in the eastern part of the states by this time. So those who were ambitious oftentimes headed west, right? And they insisted that their government support that decision. And so in doing so, that caused fighting with the Native Americans. So you had Little Turtle, you had Pontiac, you had all these other different tribal leaders and confederations of Native American tribes that rose up against the white squatters infiltrating their territory. So this was costly to the colonies, them moving west. But then not only that, they wanted loans, right? As they sometimes say, it takes money to make money. They needed stuff for, the foodstuffs, the manure and the seeds and everything to grow and cultivate their farms. And so they needed money to get started, as with any kind of business. So then they would get these loans, right? And time again, they defaulted on their loans. They would not pay back their loans, or could not. So what they did is they would come and put pressure on their popularly elected assemblymen to give them stay laws, to give them 3 more years, 5 more years, or just 1 more year to pay off their debts. And then in several states, that was followed when they still could not come up with the money to pay back their loans in time, with basically bankruptcy laws, and asking the states to just pardon their debt. Well, we inherited English common law, right? Our revolution wasn't that revolutionary from England and English political tradition. And so people historically, right, in America, if you don't pay back your loans, you go to a debtor's court, and they will take your collateral that you put up, right, as a promise to pay back your loan. They'll take your collateral from you, which oftentimes included your land. Okay. So like with Daniel Shays in Massachusetts, and that was just the most popular instance. That was not the only by any stretch. The judges would finally move into the West because the assemblymen would have enough and said, we've granted you enough pardons with these loans. You either pay them back or we're taking your collateral and even putting you in debtor's jail for a time period if need be. So they sent their judges out to the Western districts to collect on the debts. And the people rose in rebellion and threatened to kill the judges. All right. Such was their desire to hold on to their land, despite the fact of their inability or unwillingness to pay back their loans. So conservatives like George Washington were furious about this, and Alexander Hamilton. So they thought this was of the utmost irresponsibility, that was part of being a citizen, that was part of being a man, was paying your debts. All right. And you also had 3 states vie for the Ohio Valley, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio, beneath the Great Lakes. Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Virginia all claimed that land, and they went to court and were fighting with one another legally for access to that land. And then the Native Americans were like, it doesn't belong to any of you; it belongs to us, with the tribes. And so it was just a mess. New York and New Jersey gave punitive taxes on one another. Where products, goods came from one state into the nearby state. They heavily taxed it, and they began doing it vindictively back and forth, and it became known as the Commercial War between New Jersey and New York. All right. And then you have, those are the main ones that come to my mind that I put in here. Daniel Shays, Law and Order. Okay. But then with the Confederation, like I said, different states were fighting with one another legally, threatening to go to war over the Ohio Valley. It was a mess. There's just a lot of evidence to support that. There's probably good reason why this thesis has, in rather boorish fashion, has remained the primary thesis for this long. because there's just so much evidence for it. So this plays into the hands of the conservatives, who began writing the Federalist Papers. And in the Federalist Papers, right, they these 87 short essays, they began explaining why philosophically, historically, logically, why there needs to be a more centralized and less democratic government. And they were calling it by now, after Rome, what they wanted, a republic. All right. And so the idea is that a lot of the, the Patrick Henrys, the Thomas Jeffersons, and the other libertarian liberals, that even they, to a certain degree, arguably deep down knew that there was some validity to what the conservatives were complaining about. But also note that there will be a decent proportion of libertarian liberals who put up a pretty good fight against the Federalists for this new republic that will end up devising. But arguably enough of them, it mitigated their opposition. It made it less passionate, because somehow, perhaps deep down, they knew the conservatives were right. That we tried a democratic, decentralized government, and we messed it up. Our experiment with it seemed to have failed. All right, so any questions on number one? I would imagine, going back to high school or some other level, you have heard this interpretation. Like I said, it is the primary interpretation for the failure of the Confederation. And it's kind of has been almost untested. All right, number two. Pauline Maier, in her book called Ratification, she paints a picture of the Federalist founding fathers as being elitist, unconnected with the common people, and exceedingly, or too much, conservative. And she contends that, left to their own devices, we would have had a very uber conservative constitution if they'd had it their own way. And in her book, she contends they tried. It wasn't for lack of an effort. She says the Federalists, they got together and they wrote the Constitution. And then they tried to secretly go back to their own states and form their own ratification conventions and ratify it. And I half jokingly call that trying to grade your own paper, right? Of course they're going to ratify it. They're the people who wrote it. But here's where the romantic facet to her book comes out, is the people at large. She says the people at large would not have it. They were insistent upon having a say in this new government and what type would be instituted. So, for instance, I love the example she gives in Massachusetts. She says in Massachusetts, right? We're going to get into some of the conservative stuff I have here in a minute. But in Massachusetts, they have it here somewhere. At any rate, um, you had people from a myriad of villages and towns and cities in Massachusetts come uninvited to the ratification convention. Pretty much come, knock on the doors, say, we're here, whether you like it or not, right? And they would say oftentimes, I represent the town of Greenswich or, whatever, Concord. And the people in my town have elected me and told me that I have a list of demands that we want in the Constitution. All right, that we want in the Constitution, or else we're not okay with ratifying this. So, for instance, in Massachusetts, there was such an uproar and all these uninvited guests to the ratification convention that they first tried to insist that the Constitution be printed throughout the colony, throughout the state, and that there be a referendum. A referendum is like what we do in November, right? A popular vote by every single citizen. And the conservatives would not have that, right? They didn't want the commoners getting their hands in this. So they said, okay, we'll make a deal with you. We'll accept you into the convention. We'll print out the Constitution for people to read, but we are not having a referendum here in Massachusetts. We're not allowing just every citizen to vote yes or no on the Constitution. So it was a compromise. Okay. So at any rate, what are some of the things? And then, oh, by the way, when some of them were printing in other colonies, because Massachusetts was rare and that the conservatives conceded to allowing it to be printed. And other more conservative areas, like in Pennsylvania, the conservatives tried to strong arm the whole process. They tried to get it ratified before other people could come in, the conservatives, right? When there were few liberals voted in, and they knew they had a chance to ratify it best, they tried to forcefully make a quorum, make at least 1/3 of the elected members present. Otherwise, without a quorum, right, you can't have a vote. And they tried to strong arm. They went to local taverns and areas and forcefully grabbed the liberals and pushed them into the convention center because they knew at that time they could outvote them. And so you had some newspaper editors that were warned with retaliatory threats if they were to print the Constitution for everybody to read. Like the conservatives they look like villains, downright villains in her book. Okay. But like I said, the people and the liberals will not go down without a fight. And so they put up a good enough of a fight that it forces the conservatives to amend, to change, to add, and to take away, etc. Right? So what are some of the things we're talking about? Well, I don't want to get into too many because you're going to do this next week, all right, on the Constitution. But just so let me try to think of like a few obvious ones. So, for instance, the conservatives, they have a clause saying that in Article 4 or Article 6, claiming that whatever debts are owed, whatever property is owned, whatever contracts were made prior to this Constitution are valid after this Constitution. This is known as the property clause, right? And so who does that best serve? It serves the rich, right? Those who have money owed to them, those who own slaves, etc., right? Their property, their contracts are guaranteed. So of course the conservatives put that in there. You have the necessary and proper clause under Article 1, Section 8. It gives exact powers that Congress has, right? And the libertarians like that, actually, because if it's not on the list, right, if it's not enumerated or specifically stated, then they can't do it. but the necessary and proper clause gives them that blank check at the bottom of the list and says they can also do whatever is necessary and proper in carrying out any of the aforementioned powers. So the conservatives did that, threw that one in there, right? To have a much more powerful central government. Also, if you notice, with the election of the, you look at, for instance, House reps, okay, then the upper branch of the National Congress is Senate, right? Then you have the president and vice president, and then you have the cabinet, and then you have the Supreme Court. So 5, right? Of 5 major federal offices, how many of them are elected directly by the citizens? The House reps alone. That's not very democratic. So the conservatives deliberately made a very, relatively undemocratic government. They didn't have too much trust in the people. So what did the liberals do? Well, the liberals jump in there and they made certain demands, right, from state to state. And supposedly those demands were aggregated together into various clauses that we see in the Constitution now. So, for instance, there's a clause that says every state is guaranteed a Republican form of government. So no aristocracies, etc. And speaking of which, not only every state is guaranteed a Republican form of government, but secondly, there shall be no landed aristocracy like there was in England. So that was another concession that the liberals demanded, right? And then most obviously, right? And then also the liberals wanted the states to hold on to some powers, right? Because remember, they're libertarian at that time, the liberals were. They wanted the states to locally hold on to powers. The 10th Amendment, they argued for. The 10th Amendment says whatever powers in this Constitution have not been given to a federal office are left over for the states. So that's why, you have nothing about education in the Constitution and schools. You have nothing about police powers. And so those arguably are states' issues. Okay, thanks to the 10th Amendment. And then, of course, the first 9 amendments before that, known as the Bill of Rights. So the freedom of expression and freedom of religion and separation of church and state, the right to bear arms, right, and so forth. All of those were demanded by liberals. And there's evidence that the conservatives were not going to put a Bill of Rights in there. Could you imagine that without our amendments? So the people and the liberals put up the fight and demanded the inclusion of such things. So you could see why I felt a bit torn, having read the book, feeling, man, I feel great about that founding father generation of people. Boy, they stood up for their rights. They demanded, and they succeeded. And thankfully, they've given us some great legacies as far as the maintenance of our liberties and so forth to this day. But boy, it doesn't leave a good image of the founding fathers, of the conservative founding fathers. They supposedly would have had it much more conservative, much more out of touch with the common people, had they been able to get away with it. And had they been able to simply ratify their own document, grade their own paper. All right. So yeah, I don't want to get into any more specifics of the Constitution because I want to save some for next week when we do that subject, when we do that topic. I want to let you know also, let you know ahead of time. Next week's assignment is different. All right. I'm going to ask you, I'm going to give you my definition subjectively of something that is enlightened, then of something that is conservative, then of something that is pragmatic. Okay. And I'm going to ask you to put 4 examples under each of those 3 categories, looking through the Constitution. So instead of an argumentative piece, that's what you'll be doing next week. All right. So enlightened, as you'll see in the handout, anything that is, related to either Enlightenment, Scottish or French, with, putting checks and balances on power, making the rulers accountable in one way or another, forcing them to be transparent in one way or another. All those would be examples of enlightened. Conservative to me is just anything that conserves what has been historically the norm prior to the early modern era. So, to me, conservative is anything like with undemocratic tendencies or facets to the Constitution. They're okay with slavery, which you'll see. They have a fugitive slave law clause in the Constitution, where runaway slaves had to be returned. So to me, that's conserving old traditions. And then pragmatic, to me, is not necessarily right or wrong. It's not necessarily liberal or conservative or enlightened, etc. It just simply is practical. What do you find in the Constitution that you think is, that's really a practical, expediency that they put in there? That's a good clause for practical reasons to have put in there. All right. So that's what I'll ask you to do next week. And we'll talk about it in the Zoom, but I feel badly for you guys because you have such a late Zoom throughout the week. You guys have the whole week, but we don't talk about the assignment until Thursday afternoon. So just give you a little kind of leg up on it, okay? So does anybody have any questions or comments on either number 1 or number 2, or anything else for that matter? Jacob, I respect you being a working man.
Thank you. Yeah, I get back. I get off at 3:30, and I get home by around this time. So I hop on the Zoom to listen.
That's great. I doubly appreciate it when people work like that and still make it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. And I don't have any questions. I'm going to read the article thoroughly. Number 2, I'm going to and go from there.
That sounds great.
Yeah. So that's good.
Well, good. Thank you, Jacob.
Uh-huh.
Anybody else? Clara, Teresa, Kevin? You guys okay? You feel pretty good about it? All right, good, Clara. Okay, good. All right. All right, well, I'm going to interpret your silence in a positive way. That you guys have been doing this long enough in the semester that you get my style, my quirky style in teaching and how I write these up. All right. So if there aren't any other questions, you guys, I'm gonna go ahead and let you go, okay?
All right, teacher. Thank you.
All right, thank you. You guys have a good day.
All right.
Have a nice, thank you, Clara. Have a nice rest of your week.
Bye. See you next Thursday.
Sounds good.
All right. Have a good week.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.